Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. We begin today's program with an eye on the global economy, which is in the danger of entering a period of high inflation and weak growth. Many countries are tightening their monetary policy. Earlier this month, we also saw the U.S. Federal Reserve raise its benchmark interest rate by about half a percentage point, the most aggressive step yet in this fight against the 40-year high inflation. Meanwhile, inflation is hitting economies around the world due to the global supply and demand challenges and geopolitics. I discuss all of these with two economists from China and the U.S. On the issue of global stagflation, we are joined in San Francisco by Nicholas Economies, who is a professor of economics from York University's Stern School of Business. Good to see you, sir.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, joining us in Shanghai, Professor Chen Jun, Executive Dean of the Fan Hai International School of Finance from Fudan University. Good to see you, Professor, from Shanghai.
Good to see you.
Global inflation taking place as we speak. Professor Economies, tell me more about in nature, are they similar or very different from one another?
What we have had in the United States was too much of a fiscal expansion. That is, President Biden gave out at the end of the pandemic too much money to the population. And that created inflation because it wasn't simultaneously met with an increase in supply. So that's how inflation started. But then we had the war, and we had COVID in China, which created supply problems, supply interruptions, supply shortages, and so on. So right now, we happen to have both the demand side inflation and the supply side inflation. So it's very hard to deal with it. It's very hard. And additionally, the Biden administration still wants to spend more money, to have bigger fiscal expansion. So the only hope of taming inflation is the Fed increasing interest rates. And that's not an easy, it's a pretty blunt instrument. It's not easy to fine tune, but this is the only thing we have. And
what do you mean by not easy to fine tune?
It's
more than needed. What does that mean? Less than needed. What does that mean? There are a lot of people who are not familiar with the words of Fed.
Yeah, when you do spending more money or less money, you can make sure they're spent in a particular industry or not spent in a particular industry, and you can fine tune it. But if you are the Fed, all you can do is increase interest rates or decrease interest rates. And this goes across all industries. In that sense, you cannot easily fine tune it. And there is a chance that you might overshoot to make too much correction and you end up creating a recession. So this is a danger. Yeah. This is a serious danger.
Professor Economies is talking about danger from the US side. What about from the China side? Earlier, Professor Economies talked about the supply chain problems. China was pretty much free from the pandemic in the past 2 years, China becoming a production house for the rest of the world, which are suffering from the pandemic. And now China is going through a challenging period. We see some problems in the supply chain. So how do you see this issue contributing to the global dilemma?
This has been an issue. So fortunately, Shanghai now is in the phase of resuming everything, right? But if you think about the supply chain in China and in Asia, the issue is that even if more parts of Shanghai and the surrounding area are now resuming, the ports are open and so forth. If other parts, right? If other parts of China are still under pandemic fighting mode, you still have issues, right? So we know the stories that even in April, when Shanghai was in almost full lockdown, the ports were actually functioning okay, the ports. The problem is the trucks from outside Shanghai, they have problems of bringing the goods to the port.
Mm-hmm.
These issues are now being resolved, but it's going to take time. I agree with Professor Economy, who says that when you use the instrument raising interest rate, it can tame inflation in some aspects, especially on the demand side. But if price increases is in part driven by the disruptions in the global supply chain, raising rates might not help that much. And this is
so it's
why
very hard, Professor, to pin down exactly what is the reason, exact reason now behind the inflation, right? That's what you're trying to say.
Exactly, because part of the reason is because there was just too much stimulus, and the U.S. economy, which is doing well actually, it hasn't grown as much in some sense to take in all the monetary increase. That's one side, but the other thing is it's very simple. If you look at the ports in the U.S., because of the supply chain disruptions in the US and now in China, in Asia, everywhere, goods and services cannot be delivered on time. And then on top of that, you have the geopolitical issue which pushes up the oil prices and further disruptions of supply chain. And the supply chain issue, the problem is just by raising the interest rate, which increased cost of borrowing, doesn't necessarily solve that problem.
You know, about China's inflation, we also see that number, CPI, particularly shot into a point that was not predicted before. So Professor Chen, I would like you to briefly touch on that.
The bigger problem for China is the PPI, is the producer price index. And in this regard, the war, the geopolitical crisis, made it worse everywhere. So the PPI in China was as high as 13.5% in the first half of last year. It has come down to about 8%. It's still very high. That's been an issue. If you are a firm in China, even though your sales might be going up or stay the same, but the PPI, the rise in PPI has cut into your profit margin, and that's been an issue in China.
And Professor Economy, your perspective on what's going on with the inflation numbers in China?
Well, I think there are major geopolitical disruptions because of the war between Russia and Ukraine. And that already has created shortages in some essential goods. Additionally, there are extreme dangers that have not been evaluated before. For example, there is a chance that natural gas will not be delivered in Germany in the next few weeks. If that actually happens, Germany will almost immediately get into a serious recession, and that has global effects. So we have not only the traditional problem, demand side inflation, supply side inflation, but additionally, we have risks and uncertainties that we haven't seen for generations.
Professor Chen, in China, we have seen 10 billion yuan being spent to provide additional support both to businesses and also to households. And yet in China, there's also the debate to fight against the economic challenges and also at the same time dealing with inflation. What is the best balance? That is a very interesting question. Some say 10 billion is so far from enough. Others say we have to tend it really well with pace, given what is going on with the rest of the world. Professor Chen, your thoughts?
Certainly 10 billion is not enough. It's far from enough. I'm sure that there's going to be more stimulus. At the same time, in relation to what we've been discussing, China's monetary policy has some limitations. One particular one is because the US, the Fed has been raising interest rate and looks like they're going to continue to do so. So the rates in the US will go up actually quite fast. That puts some pressure on how much lower interest rate can go in China. So what we've been seeing from the Chinese central bank is that they've been pretty careful of lowering interest rates. They've been doing things like they will release more bank reserves. So banks will have more liquidity to lend to the economy. I'm sure we're gonna have more direct, not necessarily cash, but like consumption coupons given to people. There will be more direct cut in taxes and spending for enterprises, especially small and medium enterprises. And of course, infrastructure spending will go up. So I think you will see a package of stimulus, and much more is needed. But because of the importance of the U.S. monetary policy, we know that in the eyes of economists, they have very important spillover effects. So China has to watch sort of what we call the interest rate spread between the government bond yields between the U.S. and China.
Talking about the financial factors, professors, I'm sure this is a very new phenomenon, or at least an updated phenomenon. In geopolitical tensions, financial wars, to a large extent, is being exercised. Some say this is adding the already existing pressure on the financial governance of countries around the world. And it is certainly adding more pressure to the stagflation and also to the global economy. Professor Economy, tell me more about that.
We have had very low interest rates for a long time. They started from the 2008 crisis, but then no government had enough guts, if I can put it that way, to reverse the policy, to say, oh, let's sit. I mean, it's enough. Now we are forced by circumstances to increase interest rates very significantly, with a chance of a recession, as we were talking about before. The same dilemmas that exist in the United States also exists for the European Central Bank, China, Japan, and other major powers. So we have an unprecedented situation as well because of the war. Every day that passes that the war is going on, there are significant changes. The European Union has very significant problems because of this war. The United States is doing pretty well compared to the others, but still there is the problem of inflation, of shortages, of supply chain problems. So it's difficult. It's very difficult, and it's hard to deal with all these problems simultaneously. It's hard. It's hard to coordinate. Even under normal circumstances, it's hard to coordinate all the central banks. And now the circumstances are completely abnormal.
So now, how do you see these kinds of governance debates within countries and also in the global system?
If people put a lot of emphasis on the economic recovery, and it's pretty clear that we need more cooperation and less isolation. I mean, to put it simply, right? We just talk about two issues. For one, Germany will be in serious trouble if they cannot get enough timely delivery of oil gas from Russia. Now, because of the sanctions, maybe the way to work it out is that they somehow allow the delivery to be paid not in dollar, but in some other currency, including ruble. Economic solution out of this seems pretty obvious, but the problem is internally or globally, that's not seems to be what's going on, and that's the trouble. How do you balance sort of the economic interests of households, firms, and nations vis-a-vis political, diplomatic bottom lines, right? That's sort of the conflict that's very challenging. I'll give you another example. We've been discussing this for a while now, but I'm glad to see that Janet Yellen of the Treasury Department, she's finally talking about the possibility of dropping the tariffs the US put on Chinese imported goods and services. See, that's like a no-brainer economic solution. There's right, because if you do that, there's no added pressure of inflation. That's just going to lower cost, period. I'm sure most of the economists, when they get together, that seems to be a no-brainer. But for her to bring this up, I'm sure she's actually facing a lot of pressure domestically for saying that. See, that's the type of problem that really needs a lot of cooperation wisdom from the politicians to manipulate around these issues so that we can still solve a lot of economic problems without sort of violating sort of the principles, if you will. And that's challenging.
No further question needed, I guess. Just go ahead.
I agree with Professor Kwan that the economists will have solutions. The problem is that, unfortunately, we economists don't run the world. The world is run by politicians, by other people, not necessarily us. For example, one of the similar issue that what was mentioned, in the United States, there are very significant taxes on gasoline. So now that there are restrictions and higher price of gasoline, the normal thing would be to cut those taxes. Do they do that? No, nobody does it. The federal government doesn't do it, the states don't do it. And people now pay very high gasoline prices. So there are a lot of things that can be done. It's difficult to do them. This kind of discussion across continents helps a lot to propose reasonable solutions. I know Janet Yellen well. She's an old friend from Berkeley from 40 years ago. I think that she's one of the smartest people in the US administration. And I hope that people take seriously her suggestions, because they're really based on economic theory and not on politics.
The World Economic Forum is going on this year, right now. Annual meeting. It's not an easy thing to happen. They've been postponing it. Earlier, I also interviewed the president of the World Economic Forum, who has been talking about the difficulties to let politicians listen. I think there are so many common grounds that people with common sense are sharing around the world. Professor Economy, Professor Qian, thank you so much for joining us.